They studied the terrain, drew maps of control, set traps with precision, wrote manuals, rules, and rituals. Not for you to read, but for you to obey. They didn't prepare for the kind of player who doesn't ask for the playbook. They didn't expect you to move with no rehearsals, no blueprint, and still end up 3 moves ahead. They built altars for intellect and locked wisdom behind gated knowledge, thinking only they held the key. But what they failed to calculate was what happens when someone learns to think without permission. Someone who doesn't need access, someone who is access. They called themselves masters, carriers of elite logic. But mastery isn't what you memorize, it's what you shatter. Quietly, while their chessboard collects dust under red tape and ego. You didn't arrive with a crown or with praise echoing ahead of your footsteps. You didn't need it. You arrived with nerve. That unteachable, unreachable voltage that triggers alarm bells in rooms you've never even walked into. They couldn't understand how someone outside their ladder reached the top without climbing it. That's what made you dangerous, because you didn't decode their secrets. You didn't care for them. You walked around them. You breathed in an angle they couldn't chart. And every move you made was a question they had no prepared answer for. You didn't outwit them by matching their intelligence. You dismantled them by never stepping into the arena they built. That's the terror. That's the humiliation they choke on now. They held seminars, you held your breath. They debated, you disappeared. They rehearsed for power. You walked in unannounced. No title, no invitation, just awareness carved into every step. While they were busy impressing each other with intellectual tricks, you were rewriting the unspoken rules without touching the paper. They set the table, but you flipped the entire banquet by doing nothing they trained for. They thought domination came through inheritance, through legacy, through sitting in circles where secrets are whispered and nods are traded like currency. But your presence reminded them that true brilliance doesn't ask for entry. It exposes exits. They didn't know that instinct could outperform information. They didn't realize that knowing yourself makes their decades of theory obsolete. Because while they practiced, you evolved. While they performed, you refined. While they obsessed over optics, you cut straight to essence. No flair, no costume, just pure trajectory. They prepared for resistance from within. They weren't ready for rebellion born from clarity. Your moves weren't just unexpected. They were impossible in their framework. They couldn't analyze you, couldn't replicate you, and most importantly, couldn't dismiss you. They took pride in their discipline, their years of academic sharpening, their degrees, their networks, their jargon that created distance between them and those who dared to challenge them. But you stepped into the room and changed the temperature, not by yelling, not by fighting, but by doing what they forgot how to do. See? You saw what they covered in complexity. You saw what they overthought. You saw through what they buried under polished language and technical fog. And you moved with simplicity that collapsed their structure like a paper bridge under fire. Now the whispers have started, behind thick doors, in halls built on hierarchy. They don't ask how you did it anymore. They ask how they didn't see it coming. Their confidence has turned into paranoia. Their smirks have morphed into silence. Because it wasn't just that you outsmarted them, it's how you did it. Effortlessly, quietly, without playing by their metrics, without requesting validation, without needing a stage. They wrote a test. You showed them the answer key was flawed. They handed you a puzzle. You broke the frame and showed it wasn't a puzzle at all. They thought you were late to the game. They didn't know you never intended to play it. You weren't a student. You were the audit. You didn't steal their knowledge. You exposed its limits. While they were busy calculating scenarios, you were becoming the one variable they couldn't predict. Their formulas didn't apply to someone like you. Their hierarchy didn't account for someone without ties. And their plans crumbled the moment they realized you moved by intuition, not instruction. What scares them now isn't your skill, it's your freedom, because skill they can measure, freedom they cannot. You don't need meetings to make moves. You don't need approval to act. You don't need allies to be effective. And that kind of independence, it breaks every rule they've built their relevance upon. You're not just outside their box. You're holding the matchbook that burns the box from every angle. And still, you don't gloat. You don't celebrate. Because there wasn't a victory you hunted. It was a default setting. You were built for this. They were built to defend against someone else. They've realized the worst-case scenario isn't an uprising, it's an awakening. One that can't be reverse-engineered, one that doesn't march, but moves undetected. While they dress their ideas in costume and parade them around, you let results speak. And results are loud in a room full of theory. Now their followers look toward you, quietly, curiously, wondering if their leaders ever truly understood the game, wondering if they were ever playing the right one. You didn't make them obsolete. You made them visible to themselves, and they can't unsee it now. The more they try to dismiss you, the more they feed the legend. The more they try to discredit you, the more undeniable you become. You don't rise with noise. You rise with timing. Precision that isn't taught, presence that isn't rehearsed. You cracked the walls of their authority with a gaze, not a speech. They fortified their minds with intellect. You slid through with insight. And now they're losing control, not of the world, but of the illusion they thought controlled it. They thought outsmarting meant louder logic, sharper tongues, higher chairs. But you rewired the definition. You showed that outsmarting isn't about being better at their game. It's about walking past it without even looking down. They can't lead you. They can't follow you. They can't copy you. That's the trifecta that breaks their grip. And while they debate your rise in private, you're already gone. Into your next evolution, one step ahead. Not because you tried harder, but because you never needed their map to begin with. And now, they pause. Every time your name enters the room. Not because of what you took, but because of what you didn't need. You didn't chase legacy. You erased relevance. You didn't enter their equation. You dissolved its value. And as they scramble to rewrite the variables, trying to reclaim the illusion of control, they don't know the next move has already been made. And it's the one they can't anticipate, because it doesn't come from above them or beneath them. It comes from a place they never dared to look, right through the reflection they spent years avoiding. And that fracture isn't physical, it's internal, psychological, molecular. It shatters their mental scaffolding first. Because when you outgrow the structure starts to collapse inward, slowly, loudly, quietly. All at once, that's the moment they realize they were never masters, just caretakers of borrowed confidence, guards of outdated gates, relics of a dying rhythm. They weren't afraid of being wrong. They were afraid of being irrelevant. And now, you've made them look in a mirror that reflects none of their masks, only the raw nakedness of a truth they never rehearsed for. They didn't know their legacy was fragile until you walked by without bowing, until your silence hit harder than their longest monologue, until the fear in their circle wasn't about what you'd say, but what you'd already done without saying anything. They studied power through history books. You rewrote it through action, not the kind that marches in front, but the kind that doesn't stop when they're not watching. That's what really breaks them. You never asked them to see you, and yet, now, they can't unsee you. Their control depended on your belief in their importance. But now the illusion is punctured. Their words don't land. Their presence doesn't intimidate. Their rules look like desperate suggestions crumbling under your gaze. They kept waiting for you to retaliate with noise, with disruption, with rebellion. But that's not your method. You fracture from the inside, without warning, without banners. While they're counting signatures and looking for revolts, you're becoming the revolution in plain sight. Too subtle to contain, too vast to deny. Because the truth is, they didn't see the moment they lost you. It wasn't one explosion, it was 1,000 micro-cuts. You didn't walk away, you just outpaced them, without sprinting, without warning, without even looking over your shoulder. And now they're choking on the realization that the game isn't rigged in their favor anymore. Not because someone flipped the board, but because someone finally realized the board was always optional. You didn't challenge their mastery. You dissolved its context. You didn't need to climb their tower. You reminded the world there's sky above it, and the higher you rose, the more their oxygen ran thin. Their control depended on containment, but you proved that containment itself is imaginary. They made you feel like you were being watched, but now, they're the ones adjusting their posture when your name comes up. They feel it, that shift, that unease, that uncertainty that used to be your companion, now sleeps in their bed. They used to laugh at what they couldn't quantify, label it chaotic, call it luck, dismiss it as coincidence, but the longer they stare, the more undeniable your trajectory becomes. Patterns are forming, ones they can't replicate. Influence without force, presence without permission, moves that don't make sense until it's too late. That's not randomness. That's precision on a level they were never trained to see. And now they're scrambling for language, for logic, for excuses that sound like answers. But the room already knows something's changed. Because their power always needed a stage, an audience, applause. But your power, it arrives without warning, and it stays long after you've gone, not because of flash, but because of friction. You rubbed against the grain for so long, you became the texture they can't imitate. While they were performing excellence, you became the example. And now their brightest ideas seem like cheap copies taped to a wall that's starting to peel. Here's the part that rattles their bones. You didn't even try to outsmart them. You didn't wake up one day and decide to dethrone them. You just stopped pretending they were the final word. You stopped pretending their approval was currency. And the moment you did that, everything shifted. You didn't need to fight them. You just stopped needing them. And that is what cuts deepest. Because there's no strategy to counter detachment, no comeback for irrelevance. When the people they thought they ruled begin looking somewhere else, the throne doesn't burn, it just vanishes quietly into dust. And now they're left with robes made of ego and metals that no longer shine under a light that's moved on. They thought you were a problem to fix, but you became a mirror that cracked their entire worldview. They still pretend nothing's changed, still talk like they're in control, still walk like the room bends to their will. But watch closely. The edges are fraying, the tone is nervous, the smiles are delayed, the hierarchy is glitching. And every time they look over their shoulder, they feel it. Not your breath, not your shadow, but your absence, echoing louder than their presence ever did. They're panicking, but they'll never admit it. So instead, they'll double down. Get louder, stricter, more theatrical, because that's all they have left, performance. They used to think that control came from knowing more. Now they realize the real threat is someone who doesn't need to know what they know, and still wins. That's not defiance, that's evolution, and it's contagious. You're not the only one who sees it. Others have begun adjusting their compass, quietly, cautiously, watching how you move, how you choose, how you detach without bitterness, how you rise without noise. They won't say it out loud, not yet. But inside, they're recalibrating. Because once someone sees an unshackled path, the chains start to rust. And now, the rust is spreading. What's unfolding now is bigger than embarrassment. It's collapse, not all at once, but incrementally. Quiet leaders looking for new voices, sharp minds realizing they were silenced by tradition, energy shifting, questions surfacing. You didn't demand a revolution. You became the contradiction that exposed the need for one. And that's irreversible. They thought they had time, thought they had leverage. But influence doesn't wait, and truth doesn't ask for a permit. It seeps, it spreads, and once it touches a mind that was once chained, it can't be contained again. You weren't the threat they planned for. You were the wake-up they avoided. And now that you're here, they've run out of backup plans. They don't just fear you, they fear what you prove. That control is temporary. That dominance isn't inherited. It's imagined. And that clarity, once it lands, reprograms everything it touches. You didn't rise to take their place. You rose to remind the world it never needed one. You aren't a replacement. You're a return to instinct, to authenticity, to movement without manipulation. The myth is breaking. The old ways, bleeding relevance, and those who still cling to them are beginning to look like statues built on sand. They called you unpredictable, but the truth is, you're consistent in your direction, in your refusal to beg, in your unwillingness to shrink. And that kind of consistency terrifies those who only know how to follow scripts. They thought wisdom came in robes and rituals. You showed it walks barefoot, unapologetic, untamed. They thought mastery was earned through time. You showed it's recognized through alignment. They thought they owned the answers. You reminded the world that some answers are felt, not given. And once you feel truth, it cannot be revoked. You don't compete. You invalidate the entire structure. And that's the rupture they can't patch. Because for every attempt they make to reclaim the illusion, someone else notices the cracks. And now, the cracks are spreading like veins across the surface of a dying monument. The foundations are moaning, the pillars are swaying, and those still clinging to the top are starting to feel weightless because truth doesn't knock. It enters, and when it enters, masks fall off. Titles lose shine, and rooms that once echoed with arrogance begin to feel very, very empty. That's the fracture. That's the wound. And the next fracture? That nothing they do now. Because the map they drew was based on the myth that they were untouchable. But you weren't trying to touch them. You were moving past them. And now that you're beyond the reach of their calculations, they're left staring at empty equations. Their logic didn't collapse because it was challenged. It collapsed because you kept rising, and never once looked back to argue. The altitude alone broke them. They can't fight what they don't understand. And you're not a threat they can locate. You're not in their systems. You're not under their radar. You're the new horizon, and they still haven't figured out which direction it came from. The realization stings deeper every hour that while they were mastering structure, you were mastering flow. And while they were studying theory, you were rewriting experience. Now they scramble to protect what they can't even define anymore. They hold on to titles, ceremonies, stale ideas like trophies from a war no one is watching. But no amount of clapping hands or recycled mantras can undo what's already been seen. What you've awakened is irreversible, and what they're trying to preserve is already slipping through their fingers. Their obsession with being called masters is exactly what made them predictable. Because you weren't looking to be called anything. You weren't searching for credit. That's why you found clarity. That's why you kept moving when they stalled to be seen. That's why, while they were busy measuring their own genius against the mirrors of their echo chambers, you became the very reflection they couldn't control. They called it chance. They called it a phase. But deep down, they know. It's a recalibration. You didn't just outsmart them. You outgrew the entire ceiling they worshipped. And growth without permission is the one thing they cannot strategize against. It's not an act of rebellion. It's a shift in gravity, and it's tilting everything they once stood on. Now they chase the pace, chase the current. Try to reconstruct relevance in the face of a voice that didn't need volume to disrupt their empire. You moved in a language they never bothered to learn, and that language was movement itself. While they labeled people to control them, you dissolved the labels. While they boxed the mind, you burned the box without leaving ashes. It wasn't the words you said, it was the precision you carried, the restraint, the direction. You weren't trying to prove your value. You were demonstrating it in posture, in principle, in patterns so refined they mistook them for luck. Until it kept happening again and again, until it became undeniable, until it became uncomfortable. Because what makes them tremble isn't your wins, it's your consistency, it's the way your rise isn't spiked. It's steady, deliberate, grounded. That's the kind of rise that doesn't crash. That's the kind that builds new gravity. And once a new gravity takes hold, everything that relied on the old one cracks, fails, disorients. You didn't flip their game. You made it irrelevant. Because in the end, their entire illusion of mastery was built on one idea, that people need to be told what matters. But you never waited to be told. You remembered, you decided, and that kind of independence. It isn't loud, it isn't chaotic, but it's final. They stare now at the structure they used to command, at the positions they used to guard, at the faces they used to lead. And the silence is no longer dominance. It's decay, a collapse in slow motion, because nothing echoes louder than the absence of respect. And what you took from them wasn't status, it was belief. Now belief moves in your direction, because the ones watching saw how you moved through the fire without demanding sympathy, how you outpaced ego without needing an audience, how you dismantled hierarchy without lifting a single brick. They watched closely, silently, and now they're no longer asking who gave you permission, they're asking how they can do the same. The masters have become monuments, tall, impressive, but hollow. And while they pose for portraits of authority, the ground beneath them shifts, because it follows you now. It bends where you step, it tilts where you focus, And you don't even glance back to admire the collapse, because forward is the only direction your blood understands now. There is no celebration, no announcement, no parade. That's what makes it irreversible. You didn't take their throne. You made the concept of a throne irrelevant. You didn't replace them. You displaced the entire center of gravity they were anchored to. And once the center moves, the balance never returns. Now they live in reaction mode, defensive, paranoid, and completely out of rhythm. Because the compass has shifted. The wind doesn't whisper their names anymore. It howls in your direction, not because you screamed, but because you moved in alignment with what can't be taught. Discernment. The kind of discernment that doesn't seek revenge. It doesn't argue. It doesn't compete. It simply becomes unavoidable. They tried to paint you as reckless, but nothing you did was impulsive. It was measured, clean, precise. You moved like someone who didn't need to win, because you were already free. That's the kind of force that can't be absorbed into structure. It can't be bought. Can't be recruited. It can only be felt. After it's already too late to imitate. Now their greatest minds are stuck in analysis, dissecting your steps, searching for the formula. But you weren't built in theory. You were forged in contradiction, in pressure, in the kind of truth that doesn't need validation. It breathes without oxygen and thrives without applause. That's what they didn't prepare for. Someone who doesn't break rules, because they've already transcended them. You didn't need to expose them. Their collapse was self-inflicted. You were simply the proof that a different path exists. And now that it's been seen, it cannot be unseen. Now that it's been walked, it cannot be unfelt. The ones who used to chase degrees and titles are chasing something else. Impact. Clarity. The kind of presence that walks in and erases the scoreboard without touching it. You're not a threat to their kingdom. You're the reminder that the kingdom was never real. And every time someone wakes up to that truth, a crack forms, another fracture, another shift, until what they called mastery becomes a myth whispered by those too afraid to evolve. You didn't defeat them. You redefined the terrain they thought they ruled. And when the terrain changes, the old maps become decorations. This is what they now feel. That their climb meant nothing. That their crowns were heavy with fiction. That their rules were only followed because no one saw another way. But you didn't need to rebel. You just became the other way. And now that people have tasted it, they're not going back to worship authority. They're moving toward autonomy. Quietly, unapologetically. You weren't supposed to be possible. That's why your existence is war to them, not because you attacked, but because you showed that permission was never required, that worth wasn't given, it was remembered, that intelligence doesn't need to sound a certain way or dress a certain way. It needs to cut a certain way. And your blade was never sharpened to impress. It was shaped to evolve, to liberate, to end a cycle that kept the many under the few. That's why you outsmarted the masters without even trying. Because the ones who try to look smart are already lost. You didn't perform intelligence. You lived it, and living it meant you never had to explain it. Now their institutions feel old. Their protocols feel brittle. Their circles feel small. And their fear feels earned. Because the ones they thought they could tame are no longer asking questions. They're building answers. And you're not a symbol. You're a trigger for every mind that was waiting for permission to move. You gave no speech, no lecture, no threat. You simply moved, and movement, when it's pure, rearranges everything. And the ripple you began didn't stop when you left the room. It began the moment they realized that for all their lectures, all their plans, all their control, you never needed any of it. Because from the very beginning, you were never following their map. You were writing your own.